So it includes that. I would love to open it up to questions. I believe, or I can hand you a microphone. Okay.
Susan Jakes.
Hi. I have a question that's not completely well formed yet, so it may come out a bit unformed. But when I think back on the years that I spent in China and the times when the Chinese government made large investments in different kinds of technology, maybe not in things that we would think of as high technology, but road building, water treatment plants, things that were sort of government priorities that got lots of investment and then got rolled out across the country. Often there would be this moment when the large-scale expansion of capacity kind of came into this moment of friction with the way that things worked on the ground. So you'd build a road, and then you'd realize that you hadn't built the, plumbing that needed to go under the road, so the road got ripped up, and then the road would need to get ripped up again to put in the electricity, or the water treatment plant turned out not to be able to actually connect to the water system of a city, and so it would just sit there idle. And I had a talk with a friend of mine who recently moved back from Beijing, who was talking about how a lot of luxury apartment buildings in Beijing have installed facial recognition software on their gates so that only the people who live in the buildings can get in. But then because all e-commerce goods have to be delivered on little motorcycles, it's totally impractical to run the surveillance systems, and so the gates are just jimmied open, and people come and go as they did before. And so I just wonder about this. I mean, obviously these technologies, when they're implemented perfectly, have vastly scarier kinds of applications, and I wonder the same thing about the social credit system, which my understanding is it's kind of a patchwork and it's done differently in different places and they're not all very well connected. And I mean, presumably all of these kinds of technologies are subject to the same kinds of social factors, improvisation, bureaucracy, corruption, that so many other things in China are subject to. Yes? Or are they sort of floating above the sort of nature of Chinese society in some new way? And what's the implications?
Oh, I think they're absolutely subject to all these things, to all those problems, corruption, whatever it is, convenience. We can't get our packages delivered, so let's just leave the doors open. And the various priorities they've had in the past, whether it was clean energy, and they continue to have. You see this cycle where everybody gets a subsidy, they game the system. Maybe they're not even making windmills, but they figure out how they can get registered at a local office that they're making windmills so they can get the money. Or they're making really, really bad ones. They don't know a thing about it. Huge waste. Often we get a glut. That affects the world. Prices collapse. Companies go bankrupt, which happened again in windmills and other. In photovoltaic cell panels in China. What emerged out of that is some very, very competitive Chinese companies and some of the biggest in the world. We're seeing it with electric vehicles right now. There's real worries that they're going to have a glut. Nevertheless, and then there's also the same concerns like, are they putting the charging stations in place, right? Maybe they're not. The city's got this big plan to have what percentage of its vehicles electric, but they don't they've got like 3 charging stations to serve, 3 million people or something. So all those things come up, but so far, I think you can see where China, to a degree, backed up by very large state capital, has been able to muddle through these things. And there's all sorts of casualties along the way, but often do end up with something that's pretty impressive. Certainly, again, on the robotics side, there's a huge worries about a glut. There were, when I was looking at this a year and a half ago, they were saying there were close to 1,000 robot makers in the country. So I spoke to a robot expert at Tsinghua University, and he said, we don't have 1,000 robot makers. he's like, we might have 20 that call themselves, are serious about it. We have, 8 that are real, and ultimately we're going to have 3, or so, So, I mean, that's what he said to me. And, again, many of them probably never made robots. Now, that's a classic move in China. Just get to convince or pay off a local official so that you're a robot maker and start taking advantage of that.
We have a panelist who needs to leave in 10 minutes, so let's get a couple more questions. 1, 2, 3.
Great, thank you. Just a quick, Sophie started saying that we might have missed clues in response to the underestimating. I think that the missing clues has gone to just ignoring what's plainly in front of our faces. And some of that had to do with, like, Wang Cheng, former propaganda chief in 2010, said, the next battlefield is the cloud, and whoever controls the cloud will control the future. So he told us 9 years ago, this is where we're taking our army. And I also think that all of the policies, particularly from Wuhan every year, laying it all out very clearly, the 5-year plans, and the law, the cybersecurity law, and all the implementing regulations have laid out a very clear playbook, and including the technology-specific requirements that haven't been, we haven't paid enough attention to. Very specific technology requirements that are in the law, so the legalization. So my question is, could you drill down a bit and say something about the role of the tech companies, but splitting it up a bit between the role of the foreign companies and the role of the Chinese companies, because I think they're state champions, but there's also competing tensions on them. And then to remember that it's the foreign companies who built the firewall. It's the foreign companies, Cisco, Nortel, who provided the routers and the backbone and all of that, the fiber optics. So that was then the firewall. But then in 2008, it was foreign companies who provided the cameras because they bid for the Olympics game. So now we're going to go up to 2020, the next Olympics. What additional, aside from the export? So I think thinking about that would be, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, because it's Microsoft who's now doing AI partnerships, R&D with the Chinese. So it's not just foreign and Chinese companies. They want the market. They're not just coming in with competitive tech. They're going in and saying, let's do it together. Let's do that logarithm together. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, if the first thought that comes to my mind is if the current trend lines continue in the decline in perceptions between the United States and China, if in fact the narrative begins to build that this is a new form of Nazism that's building, it's a new evil empire that's building, American companies are going to be in a terribly awkward position. Intel sells more semiconductor chips in China than it does in the United States. GM sells more cars in China than it sells in the United States. NVIDIA is a very hot semiconductor company. It's selling lots of technology into these facial recognition systems. So if there's a rupture in perceptions, the pressures are going to start building on American companies to say, people are going to start asking them, what are you doing in China? Are you helping build a totalitarian state? Or are you helping to build a rival to American interests? So American business could be faced with a very delicate period ahead. I don't think we're quite there yet, but it could be, if current trend lines continue in terms of the decline in the quality of the relationship, we could reach that point not too far away.
With question in the back, and then the last question over there.
Thank you. So I want to follow up on the social credit system and ask the panelists talk about the extraterritorial effects of China's social credit system. So take the controversy between airlines and China, for example, on the issue of Taiwan. So the foreign airlines were actually threatened with social credit sanctions if they decided to list Taiwan as a separate jurisdiction independent of China. And what about other kind of extraterritorial effects that you've seen in implementing China's social credit system? How about foreign NGOs? Are they going to be subject to social credit point system in China. My second question is about the export of China's, first of all, social credit system. I think that's a governance mode. And secondly, their high-tech, intrusive surveillance technology, their export to other countries, Ecuador, other countries. Do you see any successful examples? How easy or how challenging is it for China to do this for other countries?
I don't know anything about the social credit system.
Anyone?
We haven't looked at the social credit system outside as it pertains to external actors all that closely. I'm sure Human Rights Watch's score is pretty low. But I do agree with the point that Tiff made earlier, that and implicitly was part of Susie's question, that a lot of these systems are not necessarily as joined up as some of the rhetoric or the coverage might suggest. But I think UJ's point is a good one, that this doesn't just have consequences for people inside China, that it can there can be consequences for foreigners as well. But have you looked at this more closely?
And I would just to jump in here, social media companies, WeChat and the other, the Facebook, but the Chinese social media companies in particular are now moving abroad throughout Asia in particular, and that will be very interesting to watch.
Actually, can I give you a quick WeChat anecdote, which is we've started looking at how it's used particularly by politicians in other countries to communicate largely with Chinese-speaking constituents. And we found a case in Canada from earlier this year in which an MP had actually posted some information both on her Facebook page and her WeChat account expressing support for or sympathy for pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong. And we realized that the post on her WeChat account had gotten taken down. And we called her and said, "Do you know that?" And she said, "No." So there was an example of, an elected politician in a democratic country communicating freely with her constituents being censored by somebody presumably sitting inside China. And I think that's, a bit of a statement about our world today.
But to be fair, you just mentioned Facebook. We need, obviously what happened in Myanmar and elsewhere. We also, need to look very hard at Facebook and other Americans.
Social credit score, every time you get a credit card offer in the mail, is because the United States data companies have 1,500 to 2,000 items of data about you. So the idea that this is wholly new and wholly evil and wholly Chinese is just so overblown. We need to get an even playing field, some baseline around the realities in the United States and in China without the opinion.
Interestingly, we talked about the degree to which the people of China care about privacy or don't. Robin Lee, the head of Baidu, got in a bit of trouble a while back, public uproar when he suggested that the Chinese didn't care about privacy. It came back on him hard. People were like, yeah, we do. China, take these with a grain of salt. China is in the process of putting in place some privacy laws, and we all know about the rule of law in China. But they are looking at putting in some laws that, at least on paper, would put larger restrictions on companies sharing data, what kind of data they can share, than we have here in the United States. They're talking about it. We'll see if the laws. That doesn't mean the government can't get access to the information. That doesn't mean that the companies will necessarily follow those regulations.
We'll get excited about that when 1 million Uyghurs can ask for all of the data that's been gathered on them to be deleted, and expect that actually happen.
And one last question. These are very good questions.
Thank you. Similar to Sarah Holmes' question, I recently finished a report on titled Self-Censorship and Abetting Evil, documenting the role of Western companies in Chinese government's repression of human rights and freedom. Like the many Western companies, including the tech giants, Yahoo, Google, Microsoft, Apple, all these companies, Thermo Fisher, so they have been facilitating the Chinese censorship system, surveillance system, the high technology totalitarianism. So my question is, are there some method to stop these Western companies from doing so?
Why don't I throw it up to our panelists, and you can answer the question along with any closing thoughts. And it's an interesting question. Some of the Western companies are not allowed in China, but certainly a lot of the enterprise companies are. So any final thoughts?
I don't see a good way to do it. I mean, or an easy way to do it. American companies obviously are interested in making money, quarterly returns, seeing their stock price rise, growing their sales. They have not yet incorporated into their thinking the idea that they might be supporting a totalitarian state. I mean, I have not seen any evidence to suggest that they're even open to the idea of talking about limiting their sales in China. So that would be a steep hill to climb, in my view.
I think if pressure were to come, I think it would have to come from activist investors or media and social pressure in the United States. So we saw, for example, going back to a low-tech example, the rise of an anti-sweatshop movement on American colleges. Previous to that, companies like Nike didn't worry very much, at least, about what was going on in their factories and how old the workers were and how many hours they were working. It became an issue, an enormous. I wrote about this with a former colleague sitting over there. We wrote a lot about how the sort of the reaction, how the big brands, the big retailers, the big companies had to respond to the fact that they're listed companies in the U.S. They were in trouble. You have big institutional investors that are starting, CalPERS in California or something, starting to put pressure on them. I think that's probably the most, not easy, but probably the best potential route to actually start to put pressure on these companies is back here.
Thank you, Rebecca, for moderating, and thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Tiff, and thank you all of you for coming here today. A most productive conversation.